Good morning. My name is Glenn Hampson. I'm the Executive Director of the National Science Communication Institute. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. Sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. My wife visited your city a few years ago and really wanted to come back, but unfortunately she stuck with me here in Seattle, where it's cold and raining, of course. But we're with you in spirit there, and I hope your meeting is going well so far. Dr. Packer asked me to speak to you today about the future of journal publishing. As you know, this is an issue that is vital to the future of research and discovery, but it's not an issue that's received much attention yet, and certainly less attention than other issues in science, which themselves have a hard time getting attention. So to the general public, anyway, this issue is certainly off the radar, almost a non-issue. I've prepared a presentation for you here this morning, which I hope will help explain why it should be more of an issue, should be more of a concern. So to begin, we need to ask ourselves what the questions are that we should ask. So in order to answer this broad question of what the future of publishing might look like, we first need to set the proper frame of reference and ask a whole series of smaller questions. So for instance, what is publishing anyway? The definition of publishing has been changing annually. It's certainly changed an awful lot since the advent of the internet. What do we think it will look like next year or 10 years from now? It's really hard to say where technology will take us. What are journals and how prevalent are they? What influence do they wield and do they matter to science? And those questions really vary from field to field and from stakeholder to stakeholder. Different people have different ideas about whether journals should matter as much as they do or how much they matter in a particular field, inside and outside of academia. How do the scientists themselves and the researchers themselves feel about journal reform? Is this something that they're behind, or is it something that they're being forced to do? Funders have a different idea of where the journal publishing future should head than do institutions, than do governments. There are certainly many different approaches to creating a future, and they don't really agree. Why is reform needed in the first place? Some people will tell you that the system works just fine the way that it is, that it serves a purpose. Others will tell you that the journal system is terribly broken, and others will tell you that journals in fact represent some sort of a barrier to the sharing of knowledge. So there are a wide variety of opinions about what to do, if anything, about the future of journals. Are the problems that are being identified cosmetic in nature or technical? Are they system-wide or institutional? Are they connected somehow? If we fix one thing, do we break another? Are they fixable at all? And since there are so many fixes, as you'll see, can they be prioritized perhaps so that we just fix the most important ones first? If we start to fix problems in publishing, what impacts will they have? Will these fixes have? What about the unintended consequences? Can we take a look at what's happening now as far as the evolution of publishing is concerned and see what's working better than other things? And then finally, what influence will the marketplace have on these changes? Are the changes going to be driven by publishers or driven by funders, driven by institutions? Do we have any control over this? And is the change going to be piecemeal or widespread and rapid and permanent? So sorry for reading along with you here, but just needed to explain that this is a very complicated situation. How you look at it really depends on where you are, and whether you think change needs to happen is really a function of what stakeholder group you're in, what your outlook on the world of publishing is, and so on. It's not easy to say the future of publishing is going to be X, because somebody else in scholarly publishing will give you a completely different answer. So here are some of the quote-unquote problems in publishing today. Whether these are actually problems, again, depends on your perspective. Some aspects of publishing, I think all stakeholders agree, are legitimately dysfunctional. Other problems simply need to be improved, and then there are other aspects that are only broken depending on your perspective. This table lists a few of these issues in very general terms and is just illustrative. So cataloging the full litany of problems and solutions is beyond the scope of this presentation. So let's just suffice it to say that there's a lot of activity going on at the moment. So having said this, what does the future look like? Well, here's the short answer. It depends. It depends who you ask. It depends when you ask. It depends what, why, and where you ask. And it also depends if you ask as somebody who thinks that reform needs to happen, or as somebody who thinks that the system needs to exist the way that it is now with a few adjustments. The latter group, I'll call them realists, but I don't mean that to suggest that idealists are wrong, but the realists say that nothing will change without publishers leading the way. And then the idealists, the ones who really want to see a more open world, will say that the publishers are the problem and that society has a moral obligation to reform publishing. But as you see from this list, everybody has a different opinion, and the answer is changing almost constantly. Some parts of publishing are changing and some aren't. Different problems have different solutions, and different regions and institutions have different approaches. So the future is complicated, but I think we can dig into this a little bit more. So the longer answer can be summarized with these 10 key points. These were developed by the OSI 2016 delegation, and I'll describe later what OSI and OSI 2016 means. Point number one, scholarly publishing is changing, and this presents both opportunities and challenges, and risks and rewards and uncertainty and so on. Point number two, some but not all of the change that's happening involves shaking up the current system to utilize more modern publishing tools and approaches, and I would emphasize that but not all part of it, because a lot of these are just practices that will take time to change. Point number three, tied to point number two, some of this change will involve reforming the culture of communication inside academia, and then some will also need to involve examining our own biases about publishing. Particularly our reform biases about what's right and what's wrong, what's open and what's not, what's green and what's not. We've over the last 15 years of reform efforts have developed a certain amount of antagonism between people who are trying to do things one way and people who are trying to do things another way, and we've developed along the way some biases that aren't necessarily healthy when it comes to thinking of this as a system that needs to change as opposed to agendas that need to be executed. Point number four, any widespread change is going to require a widespread coordinated effort, which ties into point number three. And then also related, point number five, we need a clear coordinated action plan for improving open. There are just too many stakeholders with too many different perspectives to do this as an uncoordinated effort. Point number six, how do we make these reforms in response to the needs and concerns of authors rather than in spite of them? There isn't a lot of evidence actually that shows that authors are 100% behind the reforms that are happening. There's anxiety, there's angst, there's disagreement. And we need to make sure that what we're doing is for the benefit of researchers and for the benefit of science, and not the reverse. Point number 7, how do we make changes across disciplines? Different disciplines have different needs. When we institute open reforms for science, they don't necessarily work as well for humanities and social sciences. So we need to make sure that we take a big picture look, not only at the reforms that we're doing, but the audience as well. Point number 8, how do we reform the system without losing its benefits? And then finally, 9 and 10, how do we move from repairing the problems to creating a more ideal world, because we can get stuck in a rut of just fixing what's broken instead of visualizing what we would really like to see. And as we move forward, developing more standards and norms would be helpful so that we can build on what's working and what's not. So those are the 10 key points that could help us identify what the future of publishing might look like. But really, to get at a more accurate answer, we have to make an even longer answer. And that involves really understanding how journal publishing itself fits inside the science communication ecosystem, which is poorly defined and which is also evolving. So, for example, science communication to some people means helping scientists become better communicators, helping them learn how to speak more clearly, especially to the media, to policymakers. To others, it means science writing. To scholarly communications offices in universities, it might mean helping manage an institutional repository, or helping guide authors into more open access publications. There, different stakeholders will have different approaches to that. So that whole ecosystem is the reason that the National Science Communication Institute was founded. We saw that these different pieces were connected, and our goal is to help try to define science communication as a more coherent field, and in doing so, bring the different actors together to work on a more coherent vision of the future of science communication. And along with that will come the scholarly publishing future. So while science communication is growing and transforming, it's also trying to adjust to a society that is creating huge amounts of information, much more than any other time in history, that is getting more and more accustomed to getting free information, free and immediate. How does this mesh? How do these expectations mesh with science? At the same time, society has lost faith that science is immaculate, that it's above reproach, and that the public has less confidence that science can provide the reliable answers. So it's a juxtaposition of all of these factors, of the changing science communication world, evolving expectations about free and diminishing expectations about what science can provide, and all of that makes for an interesting alchemy. So whether and how journal publishing can transform depends in large measure on whether and how it can respond to these broad societal forces, and do so quickly, in a way that makes sense for authors and for science, in a way that the marketplace will find sustainable, in a way that funders and policymakers will support. It's complicated. The final aspect of the longest answer, the most important one, is that whatever reforms are pursued, they need to make sense. Nothing can happen and change can't be sustained unless it makes sense for authors, unless it makes sense for science, for the marketplace, for funders and for policymakers, and for the culture of communication in science. Without the support of these groups, without making sure that what's being done is what science needs, and that these reforms will last, that publishers will be part of these reforms, and that these reforms will be supported by funders and policymakers and so on, then there's nothing. There's just a lot of talk. So toward this end then, the Open Scholarship Initiative, which I mentioned earlier on, OSI, was formed in 2014 and formalized in 2015. This is an international effort to try to do these reforms as an international community in a way that's global, that involves all stakeholders, and in a way that the reforms will be supported by everyone. The next slide will talk in more detail about OSI. So what will happen to the future of scholarly publishing? You've heard all of the equivocations about what might happen and how the decisions need to be made by the global community and how there's so many different perspectives on it. But I think even so, it's possible to say that some things will happen. So here's what they are. Number one, publishing will continue to be reformed. Reforms will continue to emerge, from e-notebooks to lab data to open data to better repositories that are better integrated and so on. Those changes are happening all around and will continue. Number two, journalists will be caught in the middle. They'll continue to struggle as their own newsrooms shrink and as the flood of science information increases. It's unfortunate, and so the outcome of that is to be determined. Does it mean we'll all be less informed, or that scientists will become better marketers because they'll need to market directly to the public? It's to be determined. Point number three, journals will continue, and they'll continue to play an important role in credentialing and filtering science. There aren't any other reliable filters right now, and that's a role that needs to be played. And finally, the issues and the services that are peripheral to publishing, such as peer review systems, impact factors, institutional repositories, embargoes, and so on, those will all continue to change and evolve. There may not be a large, coordinated, sensical evolution of publishing, but all of these things will continue to evolve. So, in conclusion, I think I've probably left you with more questions than answers here. I think over the next 5 years, we're going to see whether or not the modest changes that are happening at the margins are going to evolve into something more system-wide, more ambitious. The inertia of the system is certainly going to be difficult to change, but one shouldn't underestimate the force of the open movement, the up-and-coming generation of young researchers who are digital natives and have come to expect that information should be free. So my brain is betting on inertia, but my heart is with the digital natives. Hopefully OSI can make progress soon where everyone will win. Well, thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My email address is ghampson, that's GHAMPSON, @nationalscience.org. Thank you.